Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The funeral was quiet, the kind that felt more like an obligation than a gathering of people mourning a great loss, and I sat there in my black dress, gripping the armrest of the hard wooden pew, watching my sister, Claire, accept condolences like she was royalty and the rest of us were peasants waiting for scraps of attention. My father had always said, "We'll split everything evenly," and growing up, I had believed him, had held on to those words like a child clutching a favorite bedtime story, trusting that, in the end, no matter how different Claire and I were, our father would never let one of us walk away with everything while the other was left with nothing. But as I sat there, staring at the polished mahogany casket, I already knew deep in my gut that something was wrong, that Claire wasn't just acting like the center of attention, she was certain she was the winner. After the service, I barely had time to collect myself before we were ushered into a quiet room at the lawyer's office, a thick silence hanging in the air, pressing down on my chest like a weight I couldn't shake off. Claire sat across from me, her perfectly manicured nails tapping rhythmically on the polished wooden table, a smirk playing at the corner of her mouth, like she already knew what was coming and was just waiting for me to catch up. The lawyer, a gray-haired man with tired eyes, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, then began reading the will in a steady, even tone, his words slicing through me like a dull knife with every passing sentence. To my horror, it was all going to Claire: the house, the car, the savings, the stocks, every tangible thing my father had owned, every piece of security I had assumed would be split between us like he had always promised. My breath caught in my throat as I waited, hoping there had been some mistake, that maybe there was a clause I had missed, a final paragraph that would make it all make sense, but instead, he got to the last part and read it as if it were an afterthought, like something barely worth mentioning. And to my daughter, Emily, I leave my personal library of books, a collection that has meant a great deal to me over the years, with the hope that she will find as much value in them as I have. That was it. I sat there, staring at the lawyer, waiting for him to laugh, to tell me this was some kind of joke, that there had been a mistake, but he just looked at me with that same practiced neutrality, that well-worn expression that lawyers probably mastered in their first year of work, the kind that said, "I don't make the rules, I just read them out loud." Claire didn't even bother hiding her smirk anymore. She leaned back in her chair, one arm draped lazily over the backrest, her expression one of pure satisfaction, like a cat who had just eaten a particularly slow mouse. I felt heat rise in my chest, a sharp, searing burn of betrayal, anger, and disbelief all mixing into something toxic, something I could barely keep contained. "That's it?" I finally asked, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be, barely more than a whisper, but thick with something raw and jagged. The lawyer nodded solemnly, as if he expected this reaction, as if he had seen this same scene play out with different families time and time again. Claire, on the other hand, let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head as she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Come on, Emily, it's not like you ever cared about the money," she said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy, the kind that made my stomach twist because it was so obviously fake. "You always said you weren't materialistic, right? Dad probably just wanted you to have something sentimental instead." I gritted my teeth so hard my jaw ached, forcing myself to stay calm, to keep from saying something I couldn't take back, something that would only make her smug expression even more unbearable. Instead, I just stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked out of the office without another word, the box of books already waiting for me in the hallway, stacked neatly in a cardboard container with my name written on the side in black marker, like a package waiting to be picked up. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my thoughts a tangled mess of memories and bitter realizations. My father had promised, that everything would be fair, that no matter what happened, Claire and I would be treated equally, that there would be no favoritism, no imbalance, no cruel tricks played from beyond the grave. But as I pulled into my driveway and stared at the box sitting on the passenger seat, it was painfully clear that his promises had meant nothing in the end. I carried the box inside, dropping it onto the coffee table with a dull thud, and sank onto the couch, staring at it like it was a foreign object, something that didn't belong to me, something that had been forced into my hands as some kind of cruel joke. One by one, I pulled out the books, running my fingers over the worn covers, the faded titles, the creased pages that held years of use, but there was nothing extraordinary about them. Nothing that justified my father thinking they were some kind of worthy replacement for everything else he had left behind. But then, as I opened one of the books, a thick, leather-bound volume that smelled like dust and time, something slipped out from between the pages, fluttering silently onto the table below. My breath caught in my throat as I reached down, my fingers closing around the delicate, folded piece of paper, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs with an intensity that made my hands shake. I unfolded it slowly, my eyes scanning the words written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, and within seconds my pulse spiked, my skin tingling with the kind of realization that sent a chill straight down my spine. Because this wasn't just some random note or old letter. This was something Claire would never have wanted me to find. My hands trembled as I unfolded the delicate, yellowed paper, the edges slightly frayed. The ink faded just enough to tell me it had been written years ago, long before my father had taken his last breath, long before Claire had managed to twist everything to her advantage, long before I had been reduced to nothing more than a spectator in the division of his estate. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that for a moment, I could barely focus on the words in front of me, my mind racing with questions, my breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts as I tried to steady myself, to brace for whatever truth my father had left behind in this forgotten piece of paper, hidden away in the pages of a book no one had bothered to look through before. Emily, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I can only hope that you found this before Claire has managed to bury everything else. There's something I never told you, something I had planned to fix before it was too late, but time ran out faster than I expected, and now all I can do is hope you find the truth on your own. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening, my hands gripping the paper so tightly I worried I might tear it, but I forced myself to keep going, my eyes scanning every word, every carefully written sentence that carried the weight of something much bigger than I had ever expected to find. Your sister has always been clever, and I suppose in some ways, I let her become that way, let her learn how to manipulate, how to convince, how to twist things just enough so that people saw only what she wanted them to see. I let her get away with things I shouldn't have, made excuses for her behavior, justified the way she pushed you aside, ignored the warnings when she started whispering in my ear, telling me stories about how you didn't care, how you had no interest in what I built, how you would be better off with nothing. And for a while, I believed her, or maybe I just wanted to, because it was easier than admitting that my own daughter would lie to me to get what she wanted. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it, the sheer irony of it all hitting me like a gut punch, the realization that even my father, the man who had raised me, the man who had always told me he believed in fairness, had still, in the end, fallen for Claire's games, had still allowed her to poison his mind against me, had still let her take everything while I was left with a cardboard box of books and a letter filled with regrets that no longer mattered. But then, as I continued reading, something shifted, something in the tone of his words, something in the way his handwriting became just slightly more frantic, the sentences growing shorter, more urgent, as if he had written this in a hurry, as if he had been afraid he wouldn't have time to finish. I was wrong, Emily. And by the time I realized just how wrong I was, it was already too late. Claire convinced me to change my will, to sign everything over to her, to cut you out completely, and I let her. But what she didn't know, what she still doesn't know, is that I didn't give her everything. I sat up straighter, my breath catching in my throat, my fingers gripping the paper so tightly my knuckles turned white, my mind suddenly racing with possibilities, with questions I hadn't even thought to ask before, with the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that maybe, just maybe, my father hadn't betrayed me as completely as I had believed. There's something she doesn't know exists, something I kept hidden because I had a feeling I might need it one day. I just never thought that day would come so soon. If you want the truth, if you want what's rightfully yours, you have to keep looking. Start with the books. You'll find more than just this letter, I promise. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I exhaled sharply, my hands shaking as I folded the letter back up, pressing it against my chest for a moment before placing it carefully on the table beside me, my mind spinning, my pulse hammering against my ribs as the weight of what I had just read settled deep in my bones. My father had left me something Claire didn't know about, something he had hidden away, something he had hoped I would find. And if he had tucked one letter inside a book, then there was a good chance there were more, a puzzle scattered throughout the collection he had left behind, a trail of breadcrumbs leading to a truth my sister had spent years making sure I never found. I lunged for the box, pulling out book after book, flipping through the pages, shaking them out onto the table, my fingers searching every crease, every fold, every hidden pocket where a piece of paper could be tucked away, my breath coming faster with every discovery. Another letter, then another, and another. Some were short, just a few sentences scribbled onto scraps of paper, notes jotted down in moments of hesitation, confessions of regret, warnings about Claire's manipulations, apologies that came too late to mean anything but still burned in my chest like fresh wounds. Others were longer, filled with details about accounts my sister didn't know existed, properties he had purchased in secret, investments he had hidden away before she could get her hands on them. And then, just as I was beginning to piece everything together, just as I was starting to see the shape of something bigger, something more than just a collection of regrets and confessions, I found it, a small, rusted key taped to the inside cover of a thick, leather-bound novel, a piece of yellowing paper stuck beneath it with an address scrawled in my father's familiar, hurried handwriting. A storage unit. My hands clenched around the key, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst right out of my chest, the weight of the discovery sinking deep into my bones, the realization hitting me like a freight train. This wasn't just about some forgotten bank account or a hidden investment. This was something bigger, something my father had been desperate to keep from Claire, something he had known I would need to find on my own, something that had been waiting for me all this time, locked away in a place my sister had never thought to look. I glanced back at the books scattered across my coffee table, at the letters spread out like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't yet solved, at the words my father had left behind as his final attempt to make things right. And then I grabbed my keys, shoved the letter into my pocket, and walked out the door. The drive to the storage facility felt like it stretched on forever, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, my mind spinning with every possible scenario, every potential revelation waiting for me behind that rusted metal door. The key sat in the cup holder beside me, its dull silver glint catching the passing streetlights, a small, unassuming thing that somehow carried the weight of everything my father had hidden, everything he had tried to protect, everything Claire had thought she had erased when she took everything for herself. I had spent years believing my father had abandoned me in the end, that he had let Claire have everything without a second thought, but now, with every mile I put between myself and my house, I felt the cracks in that belief growing wider, felt the possibility creeping in that maybe he had never truly given up on me, that maybe he had simply run out of time. When I finally pulled into the dimly lit parking lot, my stomach twisted into knots as I stared at the rows of identical storage units stretching into the distance, each one a forgotten piece of someone's life, each one filled with secrets that had been locked away and left to gather dust. I climbed out of the car, the key clutched so tightly in my palm that the edges dug into my skin, and made my way toward unit number 18, my father's hurried handwriting flashing in my mind, the way the ink had been just slightly smudged, as if he had been in too much of a rush to let it dry. My hands shook as I slid the key into the lock, my breath catching in my throat as I twisted it, the old mechanism clicking open with a dull thunk that sent a shiver down my spine. The metal door groaned as I rolled it up, the dim light from the single bulb overhead flickering slightly, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. At first glance, the unit didn't look like much. Just a few old filing cabinets, some cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly against the back wall, and a heavy wooden desk pushed off to one side, its surface covered in dust. But as I stepped inside, as I took a closer look, I realized this wasn't just a collection of random belongings my father had decided to store away. This was a carefully curated archive, a private record of something he had never intended for Claire to find. I moved to the first filing cabinet, my fingers trembling as I pulled open the top drawer, my heart slamming against my ribs as I saw what was inside. Stacks upon stacks of carefully labeled files, each one filled with documents, letters, and handwritten notes. Each one a piece of a puzzle my father had left behind for me to solve. My breath came faster as I flipped through them, my eyes scanning the headings, my stomach twisting as the truth began to reveal itself in stark black and white. Bank statements, investment records, legal documents. And then, as I pulled out a thick envelope with my name scrawled across the front, my fingers fumbling to tear it open, I found it, the proof I had been waiting for, the undeniable, irrefutable evidence that Claire had orchestrated everything. That she had manipulated my father into changing his will, that she had spent years twisting the truth until it suited her perfectly. The letters were the worst, the ones she had written to my father in the months leading up to his death, the carefully crafted lies she had fed him, the way she had painted me as distant, ungrateful, uninterested in the family legacy, as someone who didn't deserve a single cent of what he had built. My chest tightened as I read them, my vision blurring with a mix of anger and disbelief, the words cutting deeper than I expected, not because I hadn't suspected this was how she had done it, but because seeing it laid out so plainly, so coldly, made it undeniable. Dad, I just don't think Emily really cares about any of this. She never visits, she never calls, she's never shown any interest in the house, the business, any of it. I know you love us both, but it doesn't make sense to leave half of everything to someone who won't appreciate it. I just don't want to see you make a mistake you can't take back. I clenched my jaw so tightly it ached, my fingers curling around the edge of the paper, my entire body vibrating with rage as I pictured Claire sitting at our father's bedside, smiling sweetly as she convinced him, little by little, that cutting me out was the right thing to do. But then, as I turned to the final page of the stack, my breath hitched, my pulse hammering wildly in my ears as I saw something that made my stomach drop. A letter from my father. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, the ink slightly smudged in places, as if he had been struggling to hold the pen steady, as if he had been racing against time to get the words down before it was too late. Emily, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, it means I didn't get the chance to fix what I should have fixed a long time ago. I let Claire get inside my head, and for that, I will never forgive myself. I was weak, and I let her convince me of things I knew in my heart weren't true, but by the time I realized my mistake, I was too sick, too tired, too late. But I couldn't let her take everything. I couldn't let her win completely. So I made sure to leave something behind for you, something she would never find, something she would never be able to touch. My fingers shook as I flipped to the next page, my heart pounding as I saw what was attached, a bank statement, a single sheet of paper that sent a wave of dizzying shock through my entire body. My father had another account, one Claire didn't know about, one she had never been able to get her greedy hands on. And it wasn't just some money, it was a lot of money. More than enough to fight back. More than enough to make sure she didn't get away with this. More than enough to finally make things right. I sank down onto the concrete floor, my mind racing, my pulse hammering, my entire world tilting on its axis as I realized what this meant, what I could do with this knowledge, what I had to do next. And then, as I turned to the last page of the letter, my father's final words burned into my mind like a brand, sealing my resolve, turning my anger into something sharper, something undeniable, something dangerous. If you're reading this, you know the truth. Don't let her win. I sat in my car outside Claire's house for what felt like an eternity, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my mind replaying everything I had discovered in the storage unit, every sickening detail of how she had manipulated our father. Every carefully crafted lie she had whispered into his ear until he believed she was the only one worthy of his legacy. The thought of confronting her sent a hot surge of adrenaline through my veins, my pulse hammering in my ears as I pictured the smug look she had worn at the reading of the will, the way she had smiled as if she had won something, as if she had played the perfect game and walked away victorious. But now, after everything I had found, after every piece of proof I had collected, I wasn't just here to argue or demand an explanation. I was here to watch her world collapse, to show her that her perfect little victory wasn't as secure as she thought. I pushed open the car door, my heels clicking against the stone pathway as I marched up to the front entrance, ignoring the perfectly manicured hedges, the sleek new car parked in the driveway, the towering glass windows that reflected the overcast sky above. Claire had wasted no time enjoying her newfound wealth, had thrown herself into the lifestyle she believed she was entitled to, never once considering that it might not be hers to keep. I raised my fist and knocked hard against the door, each impact echoing through the stillness of the neighborhood, and within moments, I heard the soft patter of footsteps approaching from inside. When the door swung open, Claire stood there in a silk robe, a glass of wine dangling from her fingers, her expression shifting from mild surprise to thinly veiled amusement as she took me in, her gaze flickering down to the file folder I held in my hands. "Well, well," she drawled, leaning against the doorframe with an exaggerated sigh, her lips curving into a smirk that sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through me. "I was wondering how long it would take before you finally decided to show up with some kind of ridiculous complaint. Let me guess, you're still mad about the will? Still hoping I'll feel guilty and cut you a check out of the kindness of my heart." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm, to keep my voice steady even as my blood boiled beneath the surface. "I don't need your money, Claire," I said, lifting the folder ever so slightly, watching as her eyes flickered toward it before snapping back to my face. "I found Dad's storage unit. I know everything." For a brief moment, I saw it, the flicker of unease in her expression, the way her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass, the tiny shift in her posture as if she had been caught off guard. But then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone, replaced by a dismissive chuckle as she shook her head, her blonde hair swaying slightly as she tilted her chin up. "Oh, please," she scoffed, rolling her eyes as if I had just told her some absurd conspiracy theory. "So what? You found some old junk Dad kept hidden away? A bunch of dusty books and meaningless papers aren't going to change anything, Emily. The will is final. His estate is mine. End of story." I held her gaze, refusing to let her get comfortable, refusing to let her believe she still had control over the situation. "Dad had another bank account," I said evenly, watching as her smirk faltered just slightly, as the color in her cheeks paled ever so subtly. "One you didn't know about. One he left untouched because he knew you would take everything else. And now that I've found it, now that I have proof he never intended to cut me out completely, I've already started the legal process to contest the will." Claire's smile disappeared entirely, her jaw tightening as she straightened, her grip on the glass so tight I thought for a moment she might shatter it in her hand. "That's impossible," she said, her voice clipped, controlled, but there was something beneath it now, something brittle and uncertain, something that told me she wasn't as confident as she had been just moments ago. "He told me everything was settled. He told me I was the only one he could trust with his assets." "There's no way he would," he regretted it. "Claire," I interrupted, my voice sharp, cutting through her excuses before she could finish them. "He knew you manipulated him, and he tried to fix it, but he didn't have enough time. That money was meant for me, and now, thanks to the proof I found, you're going to have to explain to a judge how you managed to convince a dying man to rewrite his entire will in your favor." For the first time since I had arrived, Claire looked genuinely shaken, her carefully constructed facade beginning to crack as she processed what I had just said. She opened her mouth as if to argue, as if to throw out some last-ditch attempt at dismissing everything, but no words came out, only a sharp breath as her eyes darted to the folder in my hands, as if she could will it out of existence just by looking at it. "I've already filed the claim," I continued, my voice calm, unwavering, as I took a step closer, watching as she instinctively took a step back. And considering how much Dad's assets were worth, you might want to start thinking about what happens when the court forces you to return what was never supposed to be yours. Her face twisted into something ugly then, her lips curling into a sneer as she crossed her arms over her chest, trying desperately to regain even a shred of control. "You really think you can win this?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous, but there was no real confidence behind it, no real conviction, only the hollow remnants of the arrogance she had worn so easily before. "You think some bank statements and a few letters are enough to undo a legal will? You're delusional, Emily." I smiled then, a slow, deliberate smile that I knew would unnerve her more than anything else. "We'll see," I said simply, turning on my heel before she could say another word, walking away without looking back, knowing that, for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I was the one with the upper hand. And as I climbed into my car, as I gripped the steering wheel with steady hands, my heart thrumming with the satisfaction of knowing Claire's perfect little world was starting to collapse around her, I allowed myself a single, deep breath of relief. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one being left behind. I wasn't the one losing everything. Claire was. The moment Claire received the first legal notice, her entire world began to unravel, and for the first time in her life, she was no longer the one in control, no longer the one holding all the cards, no longer the one with the smug satisfaction of knowing she had won before the game had even begun. I had spent years watching her manipulate, deceive, and twist reality to fit her own selfish desires, had spent my childhood standing in her shadow while she played the perfect daughter, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and now, as I watched her facade crumble piece by piece, I felt no guilt, no pity, no remorse, only the cold, unwavering satisfaction of knowing that justice was finally catching up to her, that every carefully constructed lie was collapsing under the weight of the truth my father had tried so desperately to preserve. The legal battle was messy, drawn out, and exhausting, but I was relentless, refusing to back down, refusing to let Claire weasel her way out of the consequences she had spent years avoiding. The courts were not kind to her once the evidence surfaced, once the letters she had written, the bank statements she had hidden, the manipulations she had whispered into our father's ear were laid bare for everyone to see. The judge didn't care about her tears, didn't flinch at her excuses, didn't believe the desperate lies she spewed in a last-ditch attempt to salvage what little dignity she had left, because the evidence was undeniable, the truth as clear as day, and no amount of crocodile tears could change the fact that she had stolen what was never meant to be hers. Her lawyers fought tooth and nail to delay the inevitable, to drag out the proceedings in the hope that I would grow tired, that I would give up, that I would settle for some meager payout just to make it all go away. But they didn't understand that I wasn't after her money, that I wasn't here to negotiate, that I wasn't going to stop until she had nothing left to hide behind. The ruling came down swiftly, decisively, the judge declaring that my father's estate had been mishandled, that Claire had exerted undue influence over him in his final years, that the assets she had stolen would have to be returned in full. The look on her face when she heard the verdict was something I would never forget, the way her lips parted slightly in disbelief, the way her hands clenched in her lap, the way her entire body went rigid as if she had just been struck across the face. For the first time, she wasn't the one winning, wasn't the one pulling the strings, wasn't the one getting away with everything while everyone else suffered the consequences of her greed. She had spent her entire life believing she was untouchable, believing she was too smart, too charming, too careful to ever face the repercussions of her actions, but now, sitting in that courtroom with the weight of her own choices pressing down on her, she finally understood that she had lost. And I made sure everyone knew it. The whispers started almost immediately, spreading like wildfire through the social circles she had spent so much time cultivating. The perfectly curated image of success she had built for herself unraveling thread by thread as people began to see her for what she really was, a fraud, a liar, a woman who had stolen from her own family. who had manipulated a dying man for her own selfish gain. The humiliation was unbearable for her, the slow, agonizing realization that her reputation was in shambles, that the people who had once fawned over her, who had admired her, who had envied her perfect life, now saw her as nothing more than a cautionary tale. The debts came next, piling up faster than she could handle, the legal fees draining what little money she had left, the court-ordered repayments stripping away every ounce of luxury she had clung to so desperately. The house had to be sold, the expensive car repossessed, the designer clothes and jewelry pawned off just to keep her head above water. She tried to fight it, tried to cling to whatever dignity she had left, but it was a losing battle, and in the end, she was left with nothing. But I didn't take a single cent of what she had stolen. Once everything was settled, once the funds were returned to their rightful place, I made a decision that would have made my father proud, that would have honored the man he had been before Claire had poisoned his mind, before he had let himself be blinded by her lies. I took a portion of the money, just enough to secure my future, to make sure I would never have to struggle again, but the rest, I donated to something that had mattered to him, something he had cared about deeply. Something that would ensure his legacy lived on in a way that had nothing to do with Claire's greed. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the principle, about setting things right, about making sure my father's final wishes were honored in the way they should have been from the beginning. It was about making sure Claire knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that she had lost not just in the courtroom, but in every possible way that mattered. The last time I saw her, she looked nothing like the woman I had once known, nothing like the sister who had always carried herself with an air of superiority, who had always believed she was better, smarter, more deserving than everyone around her. She was tired, worn down, the weight of her own actions finally pressing down on her shoulders, and for the first time in her life, she had nothing left to fall back on, no one left to manipulate, no more safety nets to catch her when she fell. She didn't say a word when our eyes met across the street, didn't sneer, didn't scoff, didn't try to justify or explain or beg for sympathy. She just looked away, her lips pressing into a thin line as she turned and walked in the opposite direction, her shoulders hunched, her steps slow, her entire presence smaller than it had ever been before. And as I stood there watching her disappear into the distance, I felt nothing but cold, unwavering certainty. My father had always said we would split everything evenly, and in the end, we did, just not the way Claire expected.